Hello, everyone. So this is now my third presentation, and once again, I'll be tackling a very strange battle that happened in our history. So just a quick background. In January, I did the strangest battle of World War II, the Battle of Castle Itter. And today I'll be doing the strangest battle of World War I, the attack of the Dead Men. It's also known by the name of the Third Battle of Osowiec Fortress. So when World War I broke out in 1914, there were two sides: the Triple Entente, Great Britain, France, Russia, and their allies, as well as the Triple Alliance or Central Powers with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. And we are very familiar with stories from the larger battles of the war, specifically those in the Western Front, as well as the tales of the trenches in the Western Front, Eastern Front, the Italian Front, etc. And most famously, the chemical warfare that happened during the duration of the war. But when recording the history of war, some of the smaller battles gets pushed aside and is only mentioned in a few books or found in the depths of some forgotten archive. And one of these battles was the Battle of Osowiec Fortress, also known as the Attack of the Dead Men. So basically, just to sum the Attack of the Dead Men up, the Germans, who were fighting the Russians at that point in the Eastern Front, thought that they were busy fighting dead people. So the Great Retreat was a massive offensive launched by the Germans and their Austro-Hungarian allies in 1915. And much to their dismay, the Russians were very ill-equipped during this offensive. But even though the Russians had superior firepower, the Germans quickly broke the Russian lines and started diminishing them all over the Eastern Front. As expected, the Russian troops were ordered to retreat and save whoever remained lucky enough to be spared. While the Russians did so, they needed a rearguard defensive. And those that don't know what the rearguard defense is, it's soldiers that protect retreating soldiers. So basically, that is a suicide mission, to sum it up. But to prevent mass loss of life, these rearguard soldiers sometimes hid in forts which were built across the warfield spectrum. Believing they would revolutionize the war, Russian troops decided to build massive fortresses with large guns along the front line with the German Empire, with large guns which were manned around areas consisting of major infrastructure such as roads, railways, waterways, etc. And these forts were built so that only a small amount of troops was needed to hold it. And it proved incredibly difficult to simply invade these forts. So when they were bypassed, the German commanders would usually raise the morale of the soldiers. Now let's get to the fortress itself, Osowiec Fortress in Osowiec Twica. So the fortress is a 19th century fortress constructed by the Russian Empire in what is today Poland. And it took them about 10 years to build it, from 1882 until 1892. And it was built right on the border with Germany to prevent a future German invasion. And when I say right on the border, I mean about 50 kilometers away from Eastern Prussia. And this fortress was continuously modernized by the empire, with military engineer Nestor Buonitsky playing an important part in it. And when World War I broke out, this fortress was very modernized to that point. And that is why the Germans really wanted to get their hands on this mighty fortress. But it did seem impossible, as the fortress was surrounded by the Belostok-Lick-Königsberg rail line, marshland, bogs, as well as the Birza River. And during World War I, the Germans tried to take this fortress from the Russians 3 times. During the First and the Second Battle of Osowiec Fortress, as well as the final Third Battle of Osowiec Fortress, commonly known as the Attack of the Dead Men. So the First Battle of Osowiec Fortress took place in September of 1914, so just as the war was getting started. And the Russian defenses were attacked by 40 infantry battalions, significantly outnumbering those of the Russian forces. The Germans came very close to capturing the fortress, but unfortunately for them, the Russians kept repelling German assaults on the fortress and finally outflanked them and attacking the artillery that they had placed near the fortress. And in this photo, it is a German officer taking a prisoner from the fortress that they were busy attacking. In February of 1915, the Second Battle of Osowiec Fortress took place, but this time the fortress was only manned by a few battalions, much less than the first battle. And once again, the Germans tried to capture this fortress with a large force. This time, they decided to try and cut the railway line between Białystok and Warsaw. Now, on the 14th of February, the Germans started bombarding the fortress again. This lasted for 3 days. But once again, German artillery attacked and repelled the Russian infantry attacked and repelled the attackers, resulting in a second retreat by the Germans. And now let's get to the Third Battle of Osowiec Fortress, known as the Attack of the Dead Men. And this photo is of the famous Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, who was in charge of the German forces during this battle. And he was really getting fed up with the Russians who kept on defending this fortress. And this was when he decided that the third battle would be nothing like the first 2, and it would most certainly be the last of the Germans' attempt at this fortress. So accompanying von Hindenburg to the fortress were 7,000 men, a sapper battalion, around 30 heavy siege guns, and his secret weapon, 30 canisters of chlorine gas, lined up to pitch into the fortress and suffocate the enemy. And the Russian defenses were manned by 500 soldiers of the 226th Zemlyansky Infantry Regiment and 400 militia. They were led by Second Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinsky and Second Lieutenant Vladislav Strzeminski. So, at 4 a.m. on the 6th of August, 1915, the moment had arrived for them to begin the Third Battle of Osowiec Fortress. With the wind on the German side, Paul von Hindenburg ordered the gas to be unleashed onto the fortress. But right before that order was given, he gave the order to bombard the fortress. So, chlorine gas is incredibly deadly to human beings. So, they saw, as they released the gas, what it did to animals and plants. So, let's look at the birds. The birds dropped from the sky as the gas advanced towards the fortress. Any animal that lived in that area was immediately killed. And the grass and leaves and plants in that area was also turned black. and some of it even turned to ash. When this green and yellow cloud floated menacingly towards the Russians, the only thought they had was, "We are doomed." And here's a screenshot from a movie about the battle, just showing you the amount of gas that was released on these poor Russian soldiers. And it is estimated by sources that were in the battle or that heard of the battle that the cloud penetrated a total depth of 20 kilometers and went as high as 12 meters into the air. There was nothing these Russians could do to stop this attack. Their deaths were inevitable. The Russian soldiers quickly grabbed their very rudimentary gas masks and covered their faces. Some even grabbed undershirts, drenched it in water and urine, and covered their faces and any part of their body that would suffer severely from the attack. Now let's just quickly go back to chlorine gas. So when it combines with the human body, specifically the moisture of it, it creates hydrochloric acid. And this acid, when in contact with the human skin or other tissues, can cause chemical burns that can be severe. This acid, if it lands in the eyes, can cause blindness, and the eyes can literally evaporate. And the severity of the burns typically depended on how long these soldiers were in contact with the gas. And just looking at this picture, they were drenched in that gas for a couple of minutes. So these men were literally being eaten alive by the air around them. So when the large cloud of gas disappeared, von Hindenburg gave the order for the 7,000 men to march on the fortress. Nothing wrong with that, he thought. All these Russians would be either dead or gasping for air with the lungs they still had left. And there was no way these human beings would survive the amount of gas they were attacked with. So when the Germans got to the first lines of the Soviet fortress, it was littered with grotesque, deformed corpses. And they thought that was the end. We have finally won the fortress. Or so they thought. As they continued advancing over the shelled out ground, they suddenly came under heavy fire. Fortress artillery had opened up on them. German soldiers were dropping like flies. And as these German soldiers looked up at the fortress, they saw men emerging from it. And they didn't look human. These mummy and zombie-like figures emerged from the trenches in front of the fortress as well as from the fortress itself and were screaming in pain. And because of the gas attacking their lungs and their voice boxes and their mouths, just imagine what zombies sound like in movies. That's how these men sounded like. So these poor German soldiers, these boys, were literally being attacked by half-dead men. When they saw these mummies and zombies, many soldiers dropped their guns right where they stood and sprinted as fast as they could back to where the German line was. Some of them had already fixed their bayonets to kill the remaining Russian soldiers. When they turned around, they were immediately stabbing retreating German soldiers. They were killing their friends just because they were terrified of advancing towards these undead soldiers. And just like as these men were crawling out of the trenches and the fort, they saw 7,000 men retreat. Now, just imagine you on the front lines of this battlefield, and you see undead men, what would you do? Would you advance? Would you just stand there looking like a ghost, just waiting for them to shoot at you, or would you run? I probably think everyone would just run back. And that's what many of them did. Some stood still like ghosts and they dropped dead from the bullets, and some ran back. And those at the back were trampled to death by the front soldiers. And those that were close to barbed wire in the trenches or the German front line ran straight into them, cut themselves wide open, and some even died from running into these barbed wires. Here's another screen grab, and this is basically what the German soldiers saw. They saw white wraps around these men's faces. They saw people coughing up their lungs. When these men opened their mouths, it was disgusting. And as far as the Germans were concerned, these were zombies they were fighting. Even if they shot at them, they didn't think they would die. And just like that, with retreating Germans, the Third Battle of Ossowiec Fortress, also known as the Attack of the Dead Men, was over, and there would never be, in World War I, another attempt by the Germans to capture this fortress without making sure there were no Russians at it. And sadly, for the Russian soldiers, their leader, Vladimir Kutlinsky, was killed because of the chlorine gas once the battle had already taken place. He took part in the battle but died shortly afterwards. But luckily, Second Lieutenant Vladislav Trezminsky survived the battle, and he lived until the age of 59 and passed away on 29 December 1952. So these Russians didn't have long to live, but they ended this battle in spectacular fashion. Their bodies may have been dead, but their spirits were very much alive. So let's just quickly look at the pop culture of this unknown battle. First off, there is a short film on YouTube. I will send the link to the WhatsApp group after I'm finished. It is in Russian, but there are English subtitles, and it is a absolutely horrifying film. They show scenes that you wouldn't really think it's based on a true story. And then music-wise, there are two songs about this battle. Apna's Attack of the Dead Men, which is a Russian band, and probably the more famous of the two songs, Sabaton's Attack of the Dead Men, which is a English song, a heavy metal English song. So that is the Attack of the Dead Men, one of the strangest battles in all of history, and most certainly the strangest battle of World War I.